wind came first. It dragged the desert's heat across the porch boards like a rough hand carrying dust-dry sap and that faint salt taste you get when you've lived too long under open sky. Caleb Hart set his coffee down and listened the way an old hand listens with his shoulders and the back of his neck as much as with his ears. Out in the scabbed distance, the sand was moving again, whispering through creosote and mesquite, sighing against the tin roof of the Silver Dune Ranger cabin. The sky was clear, but wrong somehow. The moon hung swollen and rust-red like an old coin rubbed thin by time. Caleb had just finished the last line in the evening log water levels in the north cistern fence damage at marker 12, a note about the limping coyote that kept showing up near the wash. Routine, reassuring, the kind of small facts that kept the world from tipping. Then the sound rolled out of the dark. Not a truck, not a door, not the cabin settling. A low, cracked roar broken in the middle as if it got caught in a throat and couldn't decide whether it was pain or warning. Caleb felt it in his ribs more than he heard it. It came faded, then came again closer. He stood very still. Out here you learn to let the night finish its sentence before you answer it. A moth battered itself against the porch light and gave up. The radio on the shelf popped once and fell quiet again. Beyond the circle of yellow light lay miles of flat red earth that had claimed Caleb whether he'd asked it to or not. He grabbed his flashlight but didn't turn it on. Light can be an insult in a place that prefers its secrets. Something moved out of the greasewood bigger than a man, smoother than any animal had a right to be, and quiet in a way that made the darkness bend around it. Caleb could see the shape the way you see a rock in a river, not because it shines, but because everything else breaks around it. A lioness stepped into the open. Her ribs showed beneath a dust-caked tawny coat. Her paws were broad and soundless. Her head stayed low, not in submission, not in threat, just heavy with exhaustion. Caleb had seen lions at distance before, a flick of tail on a ridge, a ripple through brush. But he had never seen one walk up to a porch like a neighbor at the door. Her mouth was full. He knew what it was before his mind allowed the word. A small body hung from the corner of her jaw legs, loose fur matted dark along one shoulder where it shouldn't have been dark at all. The lioness stopped in the low pool of porch light and looked up at him. No bared teeth, no flattened ears, no crouch, no charge. Just eyes old gold and tired in a way that didn't belong to a single night. Caleb felt his training rise like a hand against his chest. Don't step forward, don't speak, don't make the first move. He let the rules run their course and then recede. The lioness released a breath that was almost a whine, and then she did something Caleb would remember for the rest of his life. She lowered her head and laid her cub on his porch. For a moment, nothing in the world moved. The wind held its breath. Somewhere far off, a night bird asked a single question and didn't wait for an answer. Caleb took one step, then another. He didn't lift the flashlight. He didn't look directly into the lioness's eyes until he was close enough to feel the warmth radiating off her. The cub's chest fluttered beneath the matted fur like a sparrow trapped against glass. Blood had made a dark star on the tiny shoulder. It wasn't old blood. It smelled like iron and grass and fear. Easy, Caleb said, because a man will speak when words are the only thing left to hold on to. His voice sounded worn like a jacket that had been rained on too many times and still kept its shape. He knelt. The lioness flinched, just a twitch through her shoulders, but she didn't move away. Caleb put 2 fingers light as breath along the cub's ribs and found the rhythm, thin but there. The night had cooled just enough that his skin prickled, but the cub was colder than that. Caleb shrugged out of his jacket and wrapped the little body, then slid his arms under it the way you lift a sleeping child. The lioness made a sound deep in her chest. Not a threat, a question. And the answer was in his hands. "All right," he murmured. "Come on, then." He backed into the cabin and kept the door open. He didn't turn his back on the lioness until he had to. Inside, the room smelled of dust and coffee and the old pine of the table he'd built the first winter he lived out here. Caleb eased the cub onto the tabletop and clicked on the lamp. The shade threw a soft, yellow circle, leaving the corners of the room to their shadows. Now he could see the wound clearly, a ragged tear along the shoulder edges, swollen and hot. The kind of injury that didn't forgive delay. He washed his hands at the tin sink. The water came up slow and complained through the pipes. He laid out his field kit, the roll of gauze and thread and small tools meant for 100 little emergencies. He'd used it on himself more than once, on hikers who underestimated the sun, on ranchers who underestimated barbed wire. He had never used it on a lion. At the doorway, the lioness settled with her chest against the sill head, lifted one paw set forward like a soldier at ease. She didn't cross the line into the cabin. She didn't need to. The lamplight drew a thin gold bar across her nose. Caleb could feel the animal and the room and his own heartbeat gather into one tight space. "Let's see what we can do," he said, half to the cub, half to the mother, half to whatever had decided to bring this to his door. He cleaned the wound the way you clean a memory. You're not sure you want to keep gentle, thorough, refusing to rush the parts that hurt. The cub stirred once and gave a sound so small he might have imagined it. Caleb stitched with the careful patience of someone who learned slow work after a life that once moved too fast. Thread in, thread out, skin drawn close again. He counted breaths because counting is older than fear. The radio popped once more. Without looking away from the cub, Caleb reached for it and pressed the call button. Static rose like rain on tin. "Red Mesa Outpost," he said into the noise voice, steady. "This is Ranger Caleb Hart at Silver Dune. I've got an injured juvenile lion, deep shoulder laceration, breathing shallow but regular. I'm stabilizing now. I'll need medical support." Static swallowed the rest. No reply. He let the button go and the radio slid back into quiet. He set a small heater near the table and cupped his hand over it until he felt warmth. The cub's ears twitched and went still. Caleb found a vein and pushed a small dose of medication, what he could safely give, into the fragile life under his palm. He knew it wasn't enough. He also knew it might be the only thing that mattered between now and dawn. Outside, the lioness breathed. When the wind shifted, Caleb could hear it long, steady draws and releases. The kind of breathing you learn when you've stood guard through too many nights and decided leaving would cost more than staying. Something moved once near the water barrel. The lioness rose in one smooth motion, and the sound that came out of her cut the night clean in half. Whatever had moved stopped moving. She settled again, never taking her eyes off the doorway. This, Caleb thought, is what guardianship looks like. Not loud, just stubborn. He sat with his hand near the cub's side, counting the lift and fall. He thought about the first winter the pipes burst, about the scar on his wrist where a splinter went in deep and he dug it out with a pocket knife because there was no one else to do it. He didn't think about the city. He didn't think about fire. Some nights you don't open those doors. Hours stacked themselves. The lamp clicked softly like it was remembering something. Caleb checked the sutures, dabbed the edges with saline-changed gauze, slid a folded towel under the cub's shoulder to keep it aligned. His jacket still carried a faint smoke scent from last year's brush fire. The cub's chest rose, fell, rose again. Caleb stood, stretched the stiffness out of his back, then went to the doorway. The lioness lifted her head. For a moment they looked at each other without needing to solve anything. In her eyes, Caleb saw what he'd seen in human eyes in long hospital corridors at 2 a.m., not rage, not panic, but something flatter and larger. A vow that said, "Do your part and I'll do mine." Caleb tipped his head, small, respectful, and returned to the table. He inched the heater closer. He rubbed the cub's paw between his thumb and forefinger, warming it the way you warm a fingertip when cold has gone too far. The clock on the wall ticked, missed, then ticked again. Wind pressed at the cabin and stepped back. The red moon slid toward pale, Caleb spoke now and then, words not meant for meaning so much as for the shape they made around the moment. "You're doing fine," he murmured. "That's it." He told the cub what sunlight would feel like when it came back. He told it about water, the first sip after a long stretch. He did not tell it about the kind of smoke that stays in a person even after they've washed their hands 1,000 times. There's mercy, he'd learned, in choosing which stories you bring into a room. Sometime in the hushed part of night, when even insects rest, the breath beneath his fingertips changed. Not dramatically, not miraculously. Just enough. It widened by a hair, found a path, and kept to it. Caleb waited to believe it. He watched the small flanks lift and fall, steadying into something that looked like a plan. He set his palm lightly over the wrapped shoulder and felt life admit him. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding so long he'd forgotten it had a beginning. Outside, the lioness made a sound that could have been a sigh, or could have been wind through stone. Caleb went to the door and touched the frame, an unspoken gesture, a kind of message. "Still with us," he said. The lioness rose and walked once to the edge of the porch and back as if measuring something only she could see. She looked past him toward the table. She looked back at him. Caleb caught the notch in her ear, where wire had once bitten a thin, pale line in the fur that would always remember. He couldn't say she knew him, but he felt known. When the first thin light pushed up along the rim of the desert, honest gray before pink, Caleb made a decision the way some decisions arrive. Not sudden, not dramatic, just inevitable. The cub was stable for now, which meant time had changed shape. The work of the night was over, and the work of the day began. He packed a transport crate with towels warmed by the heater and set it on the floor. The cub murmured in its sleep and didn't wake. Caleb lifted it the same way he'd once lifted strangers out of smoke-filled rooms, careful, practiced, refusing to let fear make his hands clumsy. He settled the cub into the crate and latched it tight. Then he paused at the doorway. The lioness stood heavy on the threshold, paws planted, body square. For one long heartbeat, neither of them moved. Caleb felt the old rule try to rise again: don't trust what's wild, and he let it fall quiet. "I'm taking your baby to help," he said softly. "I'll bring him back." He stepped onto the porch. The lioness didn't block him. She moved aside, came shoulder to shoulder with the crate, and sniffed. Her whiskers brushed the slats. A small sound rose from deep behind her ribs. Not a growl, not a warning, something closer to permission. Then she fell in behind him as he carried the crate down the steps and across the hard yard to the Jeep. The keys felt heavier than usual in his hand. He set the crate on the passenger seat, threaded the seat belt through the handle, and tied an extra length of rope for good measure. The sun had become a thin nail of light in the east, pushing through the last cool. Caleb climbed into the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, and glanced in the mirror. The lioness stood about 10 feet back, tail still head high. Caleb had watched lions stare down storms. He had never seen a stare like that. It wasn't a dare. It was trust, and trust always costs something. "All right," he said mostly to himself, and turned the key. The engine coughed and caught. Dust curled from the tires as he eased forward. He kept his eyes on the road and didn't look back until he had to. When he did, she was there, walking behind the Jeep, steady and dignified, close enough that he could see the rise and fall of her shoulders in the mirror. A mother following the box that held her whole heart. The desert opened ahead, washboard road stretching toward Red Mesa. Caleb set his jaw, fixed his hands at 10 and 2, and drove. Morning came on hard and white. The desert shrugged off the last of the night and threw its light straight into Caleb Hart's eyes. Heat shimmered above the road like a living thing, bending distance and flattening color, until everything ahead looked unreal. The old Jeep rattled along the washboard track, each bump traveling up the steering column and into his wrists. On the passenger seat, the transport crate shifted slightly with every rut. Caleb kept one hand on the wheel and one hovering near the box, steadying it whenever the road turned mean. Inside, the cub stayed quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but breathing. Caleb checked the rise and fall every chance he got, counting without realizing he was counting. In the rearview mirror, the lioness followed. She was dust gray now, her golden coat dulled by the road, but her pace never changed. Not running, not lagging, just there. Every curve Caleb took, she took as well, like the Jeep and the Lioness were tied together by something invisible and unbreakable. Caleb had seen a lot in this desert. Flash floods where there shouldn't have been water. Fires that outran the wind. People who wandered out thinking they were tougher than the sun. But this quiet procession was something else. An animal trusting a man enough to follow. A man trusting himself enough not to break that trust. The road narrowed as it dipped through a stretch of dry brush. Heat rippled so hard it made the world look liquid. Caleb lifted the radio and pressed the call button again. "Red Mesa Outpost," he said. "This is Ranger Hart. I'm en route with an injured juvenile lion. Repeat, injured lion cub. Shoulder trauma. ETA approximately 40 minutes. Static answered him, thick, relentless. He exhaled through his nose and set the radio back down. Too far out, too many hills. Signals died fast out here. The cub made a faint sound, then something between a breath and a squeak. Caleb smiled despite himself. "Hang on, little one," he murmured. "We're getting there." The Jeep hit another stretch of washboard that shook the dash like loose teeth. Caleb slowed, easing the vehicle forward. Behind him the Lioness broke into a trot, closing the distance without panic, without hurry. When the road crested a low rise, Caleb caught a flash of metal far ahead. The Red Mesa Veterinary Outpost. Low buildings, tin roofs catching the sun, half hidden by cottonwoods clinging stubbornly to a dry wash. Relief hit him so hard it almost hurt. Then the sound came. A sharp pop, too clean, too final. The steering wheel went heavy in his hands. "Damn it," Caleb muttered, easing the Jeep to the shoulder as the front end sagged. He killed the engine and climbed out, heat slamming into him like a wall. The front tire was shredded, a slice of sharp shale lodged deep in the rubber. No fixing that. He glanced toward the Lioness. She had stopped in the open body tent's tail low, watching him, watching the road. "I know," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I know." Caleb moved to the back and pulled the spare. Sweat ran down his spine as he worked the jack. The sun climbed higher, stripping what little mercy the morning had left. That's when he saw them. 3 figures moving along the dry riverbed to the south. Men. Too steady, too purposeful, rifles slung low catching the light. Caleb's mouth went dry. Poachers. They'd spotted the Lioness. Out here, anything rare was valuable to the wrong kind of people. He glanced at the Jeep at the crate, then back at the Lioness. She hadn't moved. Her eyes were locked on the approaching men, her body wound tight like a drawn bow. Caleb grabbed his binoculars. 200 yards, closing. He didn't have much, just a flare gun, and an old revolver meant more for noise than anything else. The last thing he wanted was chaos with the cub this vulnerable. But he couldn't let them get close. He straightened and raised his voice. "Hey, this is federal land. You're trespassing." The sound cracked through the still air. The men stopped. One of them laughed, a hard, ugly sound that didn't belong in daylight. "Nice escort you got there, Ranger," the man called back. "That cat's worth a lot, you know." "Turn around," Caleb said. He kept his voice steady even though his pulse hammered in his throat. "Leave. Now." The man lifted his rifle, not aiming, just letting Caleb see the metal. "Tell you what he said. Step aside and we'll take care of her for you." The Lioness moved, not fast, not loud. She stepped between the Jeep and the men, placing herself squarely in their path. The fur along her back lifted like dry grass catching flame. "Don't," Caleb whispered. The first shot cracked the air. It struck the dirt near her paw, sending up a burst of dust. The Lioness answered with a roar that split the heat in half. Then she ran. She crossed the distance in a heartbeat silent until the last second when the sound of her fury hit like thunder. The men scattered, firing wildly their shots, snapping uselessly into dirt and sky. Caleb dropped behind the Jeep, heart slamming against his ribs. The echoes rolled away. When he looked up, the men were running, boots kicking up dust, panic driving them back toward the hills. One tripped. Another dropped something dark and heavy. None of them looked back. The Lioness stood alone in the roadsides, heaving. A shallow graze marked her shoulder where a bullet had kissed her coat. Not deep, but enough. She turned her head toward Caleb. There was no rage in her eyes, only expectation. Caleb rose slowly, palms open. "It's all right," he said. "They're gone." She held his gaze for one long second, then stepped back, never turning her back on him. Caleb finished changing the tire with hands that trembled only a little. He kept talking, filling the space between them with words. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, "but thank you." By the time he tightened the last lug nut, the horizon had gone white with heat. He checked the crate. The cub's chest still rose and fell. Caleb climbed into the Jeep and turned the key. The engine caught. The Lioness moved aside, then fell back into her place behind the vehicle as Caleb eased forward again. She limped slightly now, favoring the injured shoulder, but she didn't slow. Red Mesa was 20 minutes away. Caleb drove slower this time, every nerve stretched thin. Each glance in the mirror showed the same thing, a mother, dusty and wounded, refusing to fall behind. The road curved through a shallow wash. Then Caleb saw it clearly. The water tower. Relief washed through him sharp and sudden. He pulled into the outpost yard and cut the engine. For a moment he just sat there, breathing. The place was quiet, except for the hum of a generator somewhere out back. A figure stepped onto the porch, hand shielding her eyes from the glare. Dr. Laura Bennett. Same practical braid. Same calm posture. Her expression shifted from recognition to confusion to disbelief as she took in the crate, then the Lioness pacing a few yards behind the Jeep. "Caleb," she called. "What did you bring me this time?" "A patient," he said, opening the door carefully. "And her mother." Laura stared, then shook her head slowly. "You're telling me that Lion followed you all the way here?" "Didn't give me much choice." The cub stirred in the crate and gave a thin cry. That sound changed everything. Laura's professional focus snapped into place. "Bring him inside, now." Caleb lifted the crate and moved toward the clinic. The Lioness followed 2 steps, then stopped at the threshold. She lowered her head, eyes locked on the box. "It's okay," Caleb murmured. "She's safe here." Inside the clinic smelled of antiseptic and old wood. Laura cleared the steel table in one smooth motion. "Vitals?" she asked. "Stable but weak. Deep shoulder laceration. I stitched what I could." Laura nodded as she peeled back the cloth. "You did good work," she said, surprise in her voice and something like respect. Caleb stepped back. Through the open doorway, he could see the Lioness's shadow stretched across the porch, perfectly still. Waiting, Laura worked in silence. After a moment, she spoke without looking up. "You always did find the impossible." Caleb exhaled slowly. "Didn't find it," he said. "It found me." Outside, the Lioness lifted her head and released a low rumble, the sound rolling through the hot air like a promise not yet finished. Caleb glanced towards the door, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hang on," he said to the cub, to the mother, to the day ahead. "We're not done yet." By late afternoon, the heat lay over Red Mesa like a heavy blanket. The sun leaned low but refused to soften, bleaching the yard until the ground looked bone-white. Inside the clinic, the air hummed with the steady work of machines that had seen better decades. Laura Bennett moved with practiced calm, trimming fur from the cub's shoulder, cleaning what Caleb's fieldwork had spared. "He's holding," she murmured, listening with her stethoscope. "Weak, but stubborn." Caleb nodded. Stubborn, he thought. That ran in the family. Outside, the Lioness settled on the porch, her chest pressed to the boards the same way she had at his cabin. She kept her gaze trained on the open doorway, ears flicking at every sound. The graze on her shoulder had dried into a thin, rust-colored line. Not serious, but not nothing. Laura hung a bag of fluids and taped the line to the cub's foreleg with careful hands. "We can stabilize him here," she said, "but surgery needs equipment we don't have. Tonight is about buying time." Caleb slid the crate closer to the heat lamp. The cub stirred, released a thin sound, then went still again. "Easy," Caleb said softly, because saying it helped even when it didn't change anything. Dusk crept in without ceremony. The light outside shifted from white to copper. Wind dragged dust across the yard, rattling a loose vent on the clinic wall. Laura set a kettle on a hot plate and handed Caleb a chipped mug when it whistled. They stood shoulder to shoulder, not touching. "You always hated this wind," she said lightly. "It hated me first," he replied. The radio crackled on the counter. Caleb reached for it again out of habit more than hope. "Red Mesa, this is Hart," he said. "Juvenile lion stabilized, mother on site, requesting overnight advisory." Static answered, "Same song." He turned the volume down. Full dark fell fast the way it always does out here, like a switch flipped. Outside, the lioness shifted her weight, rose once, then lay down again, never taking her eyes off the door. Laura checked the monitors. "If he makes it through the night," she said quietly, "we'll have options." Caleb leaned back against the counter. The day's tension settled into his bones. He watched the cub's chest rise and fall, each breath a small argument against the dark. The power flickered. Once, twice. Then the lights went out. The clinic dropped into sudden silence, broken only by the wind and the faint sound of the lioness exhaling on the porch. "Generator," Laura said, already reaching for a flashlight. "I've got it," Caleb replied. He stepped out the back door into a wall of night. Dust hit his face like dry spray. He kept low, moving by memory toward the generator shed. His headlamp cut a narrow tunnel of light. The problem showed itself fast, a fuel line shaken loose by the wind. Caleb tightened the clamp with a coin from his pocket, primed the pump, and pulled the cord. Once, twice. On the third pull, the engine coughed and caught, rattling back to life. Light bled under the clinic door. When Caleb returned inside, Laura gave him a thumbs up without looking away from the cub. "Good timing," she said. "Heat's back." A sound rolled across the porch, then not loud, but sharp enough to raise the hair on his arms. The lioness stood in one smooth motion. Her body filled the doorway like a drawn bow. Caleb took 2 steps toward the door and looked past her into the dark. Eyes reflected back, low-clustered and mean. Coyotes, drawn by blood, by weakness, by the long night. Caleb reached for the flare gun hanging by the door, but didn't raise it. The wrong noise could turn curiosity into chaos. The coyotes edged closer, testing the line where porch boards met dirt. The lioness slid one paw forward and lowered her head. Not dramatic. Certain. When the lead coyote tried a half-step, she moved. She came off the porch in a blur that bent the air. A sharp yelp split the night as the animal spun away. Another darted in and met a snap that stopped it cold. Dust exploded. Shadows scattered. Then it was over. The coyotes fled into the dark, their shapes breaking apart like smoke. The lioness stood breathing hard, shoulders working. She shook herself once and returned to the doorway. In the lamplight, Caleb saw fresh blood mixed with old along her shoulder. He knelt, hands open. "You did good," he said quietly. "You did more than good." She looked past him toward the table where the cub lay. Her eyes softened in a way Caleb had only ever seen in hospital corridors late at night when hope had learned how to wait. He returned to the clinic and the work of small, careful motions. Laura adjusted the IV, cleaned the suture line again, and let out a slow breath. Hours stacked themselves gently. The wind eased. The generator found a steady rhythm. The cub's breathing faltered once, then settled into a deeper pattern. At some point, because the night had grown very quiet, Laura spoke without lifting her eyes. "You never told me why you left the city." Caleb didn't answer right away. He checked the cub's temperature, adjusted the blanket, moved the heat lamp an inch. "House fire," he said finally. "Little boy, we were fast, still not fast enough." The words landed and stayed. Laura set her hand on the table, not touching him, not needing to. "I'm sorry," she said. "The kind of sorry that doesn't try to fix anything." Caleb nodded. "Out here," he added, "I thought maybe I'd be closer to the part of the world that doesn't burn so easily." The cub's chest rose, fell, rose again. Near midnight, Laura smiled just barely. "Temperature's up, color's better." Caleb felt his shoulders drop an inch. He stepped out to the porch and stood beside the lioness, close enough to share the night, far enough to respect it. Stars pushed through the thinning dust, sharp and steady. "You still with me?" he asked softly. She blinked, slow and deliberate. He took it for yes. Somewhere in the quietest hour, the cub's breathing deepened just enough to be undeniable. Laura met Caleb's eyes. Neither of them spoke. When the eastern edge of the sky finally softened into gray, Laura leaned back and exhaled. "He made the night," she said. "We've got a chance." Outside, the lioness rose, stretched, and stepped to the threshold. Caleb lifted the blanket just enough for her to see a small pink ear, the faint pulse at a narrow throat. She rumbled low, satisfied but not finished. Morning light spilled over the porch. The worst of the night had spent itself, and all three of them, man, mother, and cub, were still there. Dawn didn't arrive all at once. It seeped into Red Mesa the way truth sometimes does, slow, unavoidable, changing the shape of everything without asking permission. The copper light slid across the yard, softened the hard edges of night, and settled on the clinic porch where the Lioness still stood watch. Caleb hadn't slept, not really. He sat on a low stool beside the table, one hand resting near the cub's ribs, feeling each breath as if it were his own. Laura moved quietly around the room, cleaning instruments, making notes, pretending kindly that this was just another morning. Finally, she broke the silence. "He's stable," she said. "But we're at the edge of what this place can do." Caleb looked up. He already knew what was coming. "The shoulder needs imaging," Laura continued. "X-rays, at least. Possibly surgery. We don't have the equipment here." "How far?" he asked. "Red Mesa Central," she said. 50 miles north. Caleb let the number sit. 50 miles of rough road heat vibration, everything a wounded cub didn't need. Laura met his eyes. "If we don't move him, infection will take over. If we do move him—" She didn't finish the sentence. Caleb stood and walked to the door. The Lioness lifted her head the instant he stepped onto the porch. Morning light turned her coat back to gold, tracing the old scar on her shoulder like a pale memory. She searched his face, reading what she could. "We have to take him farther," Caleb said quietly, "to a place with better tools." The Lioness didn't growl, didn't step back. She simply watched. Laura joined him, arms crossed loosely. "She's going to follow," she said under her breath. "I know," Caleb replied. "I just don't know how far she'll go." The cub stirred inside, releasing a thin sound that cut clean through doubt. That decided it. They worked quickly. Laura prepared antibiotics and fluids for transport. Caleb warmed towels, checked the crate latch twice, then a third time. Every motion felt deliberate, ceremonial, like they were all aware this was a crossing of some kind. When Caleb lifted this crate, the Lioness rose at once and stepped close, her nose brushing the slats. She inhaled deeply, memorizing the scent of her child mixed with metal and human hands. "I'll bring him back," Caleb said again, "I swear." He didn't know if promises mattered to animals. He only knew they mattered to him. They loaded the crate into the Jeep. The engine started with a tired growl. Dust lifted as the tires rolled forward. The Lioness followed. Not close enough to crowd, not far enough to be mistaken for coincidence. The road north was worse than the one behind them. Rutted, broken, long stretches of nothing where the heat pressed down and the sky offered no mercy. Caleb drove slower than he wanted to, easing the Jeep through dips and rocks, checking the crate every few minutes. Laura sat rigid in the passenger seat, one hand braced on the dash. "She hasn't fallen back once," she said quietly, glancing in the mirror. Caleb nodded. "She won't." 20 miles in the land narrowed into scrub and stone. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and something else. Movement ahead. Caleb slowed. 3 men stood near a broken fence line, rifles slung low. Not rangers, not ranchers. Their posture gave them away. Laura's breath caught. No. Caleb's jaw tightened. Same kind of trouble. The men stepped onto the road, spreading out like they owned it. One raised a hand in mock greeting. "Morning, Ranger. Heard you had yourself a lion cub." Caleb didn't answer. He eased the Jeep forward anyway. A shot rang out. The bullet slammed into the fender metal, shrieking. Laura ducked, shouting. The Jeep skidded to a stop. Behind them, the Lioness broke into a run. Not panic. Purpose. She came out of the brush like a living force, dust exploding under her paws. The men barely had time to turn. Her roar hit first deep, full, undeniable. The men scattered. One fired wildly. Another dropped his rifle and ran. The third tripped, scrambling back to his feet as the Lioness struck the ground between them, cutting off the road entirely. Caleb jumped from the Jeep, heart-hammering. "Enough," he shouted, though the words weren't meant for her. The men didn't need convincing. They vanished into the scrub, leaving silence behind them like debris. The Lioness stood breathing hard, sides heaving. A shallow cut marked her flank where a bullet had grazed her. Caleb approached slowly, hands open. "You saved us," Laura whispered, stepping out behind him. The lioness turned her head toward Caleb. Her eyes weren't wild. They were steady. Caleb knelt and wrapped a cloth around the wound, working quickly, gently. She flinched once, then held still. "There," he murmured. "That's all I can do for now." For a long second she studied him. Then she stepped back and resumed her place behind the jeep. They drove the rest of the way in silence. When the Red Mesa Central facility finally rose ahead, solar panels, gleaming water tower, standing like a promise, Caleb felt his legs go weak with relief. Staff rushed out. The crate was lifted. Doors opened and closed. The cub disappeared into bright halls and human voices. At the fence line, the lioness stopped. She did not cross. She sat watching. Caleb walked back to her, standing a respectful distance away. "They're helping him," he said softly. "He's safe now." The lioness lowered herself to the ground, resting her head on her paws. For the first time since he'd met her, Caleb saw the fight ease out of her body. Not gone, just resting. Inside the facility, the battle for the cub's life began again, this time with machines and sterile light. Outside, a mother waited, and Caleb stood between those two worlds, knowing there was no turning back now. Red Mesa Central smelled like clean metal and old sun. Caleb noticed it the moment the doors closed behind the crate, the sharp bite of disinfectant layered over something warmer, older, like dust baked into concrete. The cub disappeared down a corridor bright enough to hurt the eyes, carried by people who moved fast and spoke in clipped phrases meant to keep fear from getting ideas. Laura walked beside the gurney until a nurse gently guided her away. "We'll take it from here," the woman said. Calm, certain. The kind of voice you trust because it doesn't ask you to. The doors swung shut. Caleb stood there longer than necessary, staring at the blank surface where life had just passed through. His hands felt empty. He flexed his fingers, then let them fall to his sides. Outside, beyond the glass, the lioness waited. She sat just inside the fence line, far enough from the building to avoid alarms, close enough to see the doors. Her body was still, but her eyes tracked every movement, every shadow, every human who crossed the yard. "She hasn't moved," Laura said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "No," Caleb replied. "She won't." They stepped outside together. The afternoon light had softened, stretched thin by distance and heat. The lioness lifted her head when she saw them, ears forward, attention sharp. Caleb stopped a few yards away, hands visible. "He's inside," he said softly. "They're helping him." The lioness did not answer in any way that could be translated, but she did something else. She blinked, slow, deliberate, and lowered her head again. Laura let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "I've worked wildlife cases for 20 years, she said under her breath. "I've never seen trust like that." "Neither have I," Caleb said. Time stretched. Inside, hours passed, marked only by the movement of shadows across the hallway floor. Surgery lights glowed behind frosted glass. Machines hummed. Voices came and went, muffled by walls and distance. Caleb sat on a bench near the window, elbows on his knees. Laura paced once, twice, then stopped pacing and sat beside him. "They're repairing the shoulder," she said after checking in with the surgical team. "Pins, stabilization. If infection doesn't set in," if Caleb repeated. Laura nodded. "If." Outside, the lioness shifted position as the sun dipped lower. She rose, once paced the fence line, then returned to the same spot she'd chosen earlier. The shallow wound on her flank had dried. She favored it slightly, but she did not lie on the injured side. Guarding hurt was still guarding. As dusk approached, a nurse finally stepped through the doors. Caleb was on his feet before she finished her first word. "The surgery went well," she said. "The cub's under sedation now, breathing steady. We'll monitor through the night, but he's got a real chance." The room seemed to tilt. Laura pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes bright. Caleb closed his eyes for a second, just long enough to steady himself. "Can she see him?" he asked. The nurse hesitated, then nodded. From outside the enclosure, briefly, they wheeled the crate to a secured porch area, metal bars separating wild from human. Caleb knelt and unlatched the side panel just enough for light and scent to pass through. The lioness approached at once. She stopped inches from the barrier, her nose lifting, drawing in the smell of antiseptic metal and her child beneath it all. A low rumble rose from her chest, soft, vibrating, full of something that wasn't fear anymore. Inside the crate, the cub stirred. Just once. A tiny sound slipped from his throat, thin, reedy, alive. The lioness answered immediately. Not loud, not fierce. A sound shaped like relief. Laura turned away, wiping her eyes. Caleb stayed where he was, heart pounding, watching something older than rules play out in front of him. They stayed like that for a long time, mother and cub separated by bars, connected by breath and sound. When the moment passed, the lioness stepped back. She did not leave. She simply sat again, her body finally lowering fully to the ground. "She knows," Laura whispered. "He's alive." Caleb nodded. "She trusted us to do our part." Night settled over Red Mesa Central. The facility lights buzzed on, casting long white rectangles across the yard. Staff moved quietly now, voices low, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of the place. Caleb took the first real breath he'd allowed himself all day. For the first time since the Red Moon night at Silver Dune, there was nothing left to do but wait. And outside, under the rising stars, a lioness kept watch, no longer standing at a door in desperation, but lying in the dust with patience earned the hard way. The cub slept, and the world just for this night held together. Morning returned gently this time, not with the harsh white glare of the open desert, but with a softer light filtered through dust and glass. Red Mesa Central stirred awake in layers, footsteps in hallways, the quiet clink of instruments, the low murmur of voices that had learned how to speak without waking fear. Caleb woke in a chair beside the observation window, his neck stiff, his boots still on. For a moment he didn't remember where he was. Then he saw the small rise and fall beneath the white blanket on the table beyond the glass. The cub, alive. Laura stood nearby, sipping coffee that had long since gone lukewarm. She looked tired in the way people look when exhaustion has been holding hands with relief. "He made it through the night," she said softly. "Vitals are steady, no fever." Caleb nodded, letting the words sink in piece by piece. "Can I see him?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You already are." They stood together, watching the tiny chest move in a rhythm that felt almost ordinary now. Metal pins held the shoulder in place, clean and precise. Modern care wrapped around something ancient and wild. Outside, the lioness was still there. She had not moved far from the fence line all night. A thin layer of dust coated her coat, but her posture was calmer now, less coiled, more grounded. When Caleb stepped onto the porch, she lifted her head, eyes finding him instantly. "He's still fighting," Caleb told her quietly. "Strong." The lioness blinked once. Slow, intentional. That was all. The day unfolded in careful increments. Fluids adjusted, antibiotics administered, notes written and rewritten. Laura explained what came next: weeks of rest, limited movement, slow rebuilding of strength. "He can't go back yet," she said. "Not for a while." Caleb understood before she finished. He glanced toward the fence. "She's going to stay," he said. Laura nodded. "I think she already decided that." By afternoon, the cub stirred more often. His eyes opened briefly, clouded, unfocused, but open. When Caleb leaned closer, the cub's nose twitched as if recognizing something familiar. "That's you," Laura murmured. "You're part of his world now." Caleb wasn't sure how to feel about that. He'd spent years making himself small in the desert, careful not to leave marks, careful not to matter too much. Now here he was, written into the story of something that would outlast him. As the sun dipped again, staff brought out a small enclosure, secure, shaded open enough for air and sound to pass through. With careful coordination, they moved the cub outside. The lioness rose instantly. She approached the barrier, muscles tense, then stopped when Caleb raised a hand, not in command, just in reassurance. "It's okay," he said. "He's right here." The cub lifted his head weakly and let out a thin, wavering sound. The lioness answered. The sound that came from her was low and full, vibrating through the ground. Not fear, not anger. Recognition. Mother and child reached for each other through sight and sound and scent, closing a distance that had weighed on both of them for days. Laura covered her mouth, eyes shining. "I've seen reunions," she whispered, "but not like this." They stayed that way until dusk softened the edges of the world again. That night Caleb made a choice. He brought a folding chair outside and set it near the fence, not too close, not too far. He sat there as darkness settled, listening to the desert reclaim its sounds. "You're not doing this alone," Laura said from the doorway. "No," Caleb agreed. "I'm not." The lioness lay down within sight of the enclosure, her body curved protectively toward her cub. Every so often she lifted her head, checking the space between them. Time passed differently now, not measured in emergencies but in patience. Days followed, then more days. The cub grew stronger in small, undeniable ways. He learned to sit without wobbling. He tested his weight on the healing shoulder. He discovered his own voice, thin at first, then clearer. Caleb was there for all of it. He spoke less than he had that first night, but when he did, the cub seemed to listen. Laura teased him about it. "You know he doesn't understand English," she said. Caleb smiled. "Neither does the desert. Still talks back." One evening, as the sun bled out behind the hills, Laura stood beside him watching the cub paw clumsily at a dangling rope. "When he's ready," she said, "you'll have to take him home." Caleb swallowed. "I know." Outside the fence, the lioness watched them both, patient and unyielding. Some promises don't rush. They wait until the world is ready to keep them. Weeks changed the desert in quiet ways. The light grew sharper. The air thinned and cooled at night. Shadows stretched longer across the yard at Red Mesa Central, and the rhythms of the place settled into something like routine. The cub grew. Not quickly, not dramatically, but enough. Each day he put a little more weight on his healing shoulder. Each day his steps steadied, his balance improved. The limp faded from a stumble to a memory. The pins held. The wound closed clean and strong. Caleb watched it happen, the way you watch a clock when time matters, noticing every small movement, every sign that the world was still willing to cooperate. Laura signed off on longer periods outside the enclosure. Controlled space, soft ground, no sudden stress. The lioness never left. She stayed just beyond the fence line, always within sight. Rangers passing through learned to give her space. No one needed to be told twice. There was something about the way she held herself, calm, unyielding, that made rules unnecessary. One morning, Caleb found fresh tracks near the outer gate. Large paws, smaller ones beside them, matching strides. "She's teaching him," Laura said when he showed her. "Even from here." The cub learned fast. He chased shadows. He pounced on rope toys with clumsy enthusiasm. When he fell, he got back up again, shaking dust from his coat like it was nothing worth remembering. Caleb felt something warm and unfamiliar settle in his chest. Pride, maybe, or gratitude. The day Laura finally nodded and said, "He's ready," the words landed heavier than Caleb expected. They packed the transport crate one last time, not with urgency now, but with care. Familiar towels, familiar scents. The cub stepped inside on his own, turning once before settling, eyes bright and alert. Outside the gate, the lioness rose. She didn't pace, she didn't rush. She simply waited. The drive back to Silver Dune felt different. The road was the same, long, uneven, sun-scorched, but Caleb's hands were steadier on the wheel. The lioness followed as she always had, but her stride was lighter now, confident in the ending she could already feel approaching. They reached the clearing near Caleb's cabin just as the afternoon light began to soften. Caleb parked the Jeep and shut off the engine. For a moment no one moved. Then he stepped out and opened the crate. The cub hesitated, nostrils flaring as he took in the open air. He stepped forward once, twice, then broke into a small, awkward trot. The lioness closed the distance in 3 powerful strides. She lowered her head, pressing it gently to her cub's shoulder, pulling him into the shelter of her chest. The sound that rose from her was unlike anything Caleb had ever heard, part rumble, part breath, part heartbeat. The cub answered, burying his face in her fur. Caleb turned away, blinking hard. Laura placed a hand on his shoulder. "You kept your promise," she said softly. "No," Caleb replied, voice thick. "We did." The lioness lifted her head and looked at him. "Not long." "Just enough." Then she turned toward the open land. The cub followed, glancing back once, ears flicking, eyes bright. Mother and son moved into the tall grass, their coats catching the last light, until the desert swallowed them whole. The clearing fell silent. Caleb stood there long after they were gone, the world feeling bigger and lighter at the same time. Some promises don't end. They return the shape of a life you thought you'd lost. Autumn came quietly to Silverdune. The heat no longer pressed like a hand on the back of the neck. Nights cooled enough to make a small fire feel earned. The wind carried a faint promise of rain that never quite arrived, just enough moisture in the air to soften the edges of things. Caleb Hart slipped back into his old routines. Fence lines in the morning, water checks by noon, solar panels wiped clean of dust in the long afternoons. The cabin looked almost peaceful again, patched roof, a sturdier porch rail, the coffee tin full of screws he kept meaning to sort. 3 months had passed since the release. 3 months since the Lioness and her cub had stepped into the tall grass and vanished into the gold. Some nights Caleb still found himself listening for the soft sound of paws in the dirt, the low breath that had once hovered at the edge of his porch. But the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt settled. One late afternoon, while repairing a stretch of wire near the southern ridge, Caleb saw the tracks, fresh. 2 sets of paw prints pressed deep into the soft sand. One broad and heavy, the other smaller, but no longer tentative. The stride matched the larger print almost perfectly. Caleb crouched, tracing the edge of one print with his finger. The wind shifted, and a familiar prickle ran up the back of his neck. He stood slowly. From the line of acacia trees beyond the wash, movement emerged. First the Lioness. Her coat gleamed bronze in the slanted light, the old scar along her shoulder pale against the gold. She stepped into the open with the same quiet authority Caleb remembered. Then the young male followed, taller now, lean, strong. The beginnings of a mane darkened his neck, catching the light like smoke. He moved with confidence, his steps sure, his head high. Caleb forgot to breathe. They stopped about 30 yards away. The Lioness held her ground. The young lion stepped slightly ahead of her, eyes fixed on Caleb, not aggressive, not afraid. Curious. Well, Caleb murmured, voice rough. I'll be damned. He lowered his head, not submission, just respect. The Lioness tilted hers in the faintest echo of acknowledgement. Behind him gravel crunched. Caleb turned as Laura's Jeep rolled to a stop nearby, engine ticking as it cooled. She stepped out, wiping dust from her hands. Caleb, I brought the... She stopped. Oh, she whispered. My God. They stood together, saying nothing, afraid that sound might break the moment. The young lion took a few tentative steps forward, then stopped. His ears flicked. His gaze never left Caleb. He remembers you, Laura said softly. Caleb smiled, something warm and unguarded spreading through his chest. Guess we made an impression. After a long moment, the Lioness turned her head toward the horizon. It was time. She stepped back, nudging her son gently with her shoulder. The young lion hesitated, then followed, glancing back once more before turning away. Within seconds, they melted into the tall grass, leaving only the tracks behind. Laura let out a slow breath. Did you ever think you'd see them again? Caleb shook his head. I hoped. That's different. That night, Caleb sat on his porch beneath a sky full of hard, bright stars. The paw prints were still visible near the steps, glowing faintly in the moonlight. He didn't sweep them away. Some reminders deserved to stay. A week later, while on patrol near the northern boundary, he found more signs, scratched bark on a mesquite-broken brush, fresh tracks circling the ridge. They weren't passing through. They were nearby. Caleb logged the sightings, careful with his words. Some details felt too personal for reports. Better kept between the land and those who listened. By midwinter, the desert went quiet again. Nights stretched long. Frost whispered at the edges of the windows. Caleb kept his fire small and steady, his evenings filled with the scratch of pen on paper and the distant calls of coyotes. Then came the storm. Thunder rolled across the plain like a slow drum. Lightning flickered beyond the ridge, turning the world white for a heartbeat at a time. Rain hammered the tin roof, a rare gift, loud and sudden. Caleb was half asleep when the radio crackled to life. Silverdune, this is Ranger Cole from North Outpost. You copy. Caleb grabbed the receiver. Go ahead. Large cat activity near your sector. Probably your Lioness and the young male. Stay inside. Keep your lights off. Caleb glanced toward the door. "Copy," he said. "They won't bother me." The line went dead. Outside, the storm deepened. Between flashes of lightning, Caleb saw movement beyond the porch. Two shapes. He opened the door just enough to smell wet earth and cold rain. The lioness stood there, soaked and solid eyes glowing softly in the dark. Beside her stood the young lion, bigger now, stronger, his presence filling the night. They weren't hunting. They were watching. Caleb stepped onto the porch, rain soaking his shirt. He raised one hand slowly. "You're all right," he said quietly. "I'm all right, too." The lioness blinked once. The young lion released a low rumble that rolled beneath the thunder. Then, as if satisfied, they turned and vanished into the curtain of rain. Morning came clean and bright. Fresh tracks led away from the cabin, broad and unhurried. Caleb followed them a short distance until they disappeared into brush. He stood there a long time, the sun warming his face, the quiet full instead of empty. The desert had gone back to its rhythm, but something inside him had changed for good. The desert went silver that night. Moonlight poured across the land, flattening color and stretching shadows until every rock looked like something waiting. Caleb Hart drove slowly through the narrow canyon east of Silver Dune, the Jeep's headlights cutting a thin tunnel through stone and brush. Beside him, Laura studied a folded map, her flashlight bouncing gently with the movement of the road. "You're sure this trail loops back?" she asked. "I've driven it 100 times. Caleb said, tapping the dashboard. "It just looks different at night." The Jeep jolted hard. Metal screamed. The engine coughed once, twice, then died. Caleb coasted to a stop, silence rushing in behind the ticking of hot metal. Laura exhaled sharply. "Don't tell me." He turned the key again. Nothing. "Starter," he said, already opening the door. Probably shook it loose back on the ridge. The air outside was colder than he expected, sharp enough to carry sound for miles. Laura stepped out after him, hugging her jacket close. "Can you fix it?" "Not out here." Caleb reached for his radio and pressed the call button. "Static." He turned slowly, scanning the canyon walls. "Signal's dead. Rock faces are blocking it." They stood there listening. At first there was only wind threading through brush. Then came the sound, high, broken, almost like laughter. Laura froze. "Tell me that's the radio." Caleb's jaw tightened. "No, that's hyenas." The sound came again, closer this time, splitting into overlapping echoes that bounced off stone and returned, twisted. Eyes appeared at the edge of the headlights, then shoulders, then teeth catching the moonlight. "Get in the Jeep," Caleb said. They slammed the doors just as something thudded against the hood. Claws scraped metal. Another body hit the side panel, rocking the vehicle. Laura's voice shook. "They're circling." Caleb grabbed the flare gun from the glove compartment. He cracked the door and fired. The flare burst overhead in a wash of red fire, bathing the canyon in violent light. The hyenas scattered, yipping, disoriented. But only for a moment. The flare hissed out. The laughter returned closer, bolder. Caleb shut the door hard. That bought us seconds. The sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse. Something heavier moved beyond the lights. Slow, deliberate. Then the roar came. Deep, full, ancient. It rolled through the canyon like thunder under stone. The hyenas froze. Two shapes emerged from the dark. The lioness came first. Low, powerful. Her coat catching the moonlight in dull gold. Beside her, the young male stepped forward, taller now, broader through the chest, the beginnings of his mane dark against his neck. Laura's hand flew to her mouth. "Caleb!" "I know," he whispered. The lioness charged. She hit the pack with precision born of survival, her movements fast and final. The young male followed, raw strength meeting wild chaos. Hyenas scattered, their laughter breaking into panic as dust and shadow exploded around them. The canyon filled with motion, then emptied just as quickly. The hyenas fled, vanishing into the dark like a bad memory. Silence returned. The lioness stood panting and the road chest heaving. The young male paced beside her, head high, scanning the canyon walls. Caleb stepped out slowly, hands open. "You came?" he said, voice barely steady. The lioness turned toward him. Her eyes held no threat, only recognition. The young lion released a low rumble, not warning, not challenge. Acknowledgement. Laura stepped beside Caleb, tears shining. "They didn't just stumble onto us." Caleb nodded. "No." They followed. The lioness glanced once toward the dark, where danger had fled, then back at Caleb. For a moment her gaze lingered steady, knowing. The debt was paid. She turned and nudged her son with her shoulder. Together they moved toward the ridge, their silhouettes framed by moonlight. Before disappearing, the young lion looked back, once his eyes bright, unafraid. Laura exhaled shakily. "I don't think I'll ever forget that." Caleb watched until the night swallowed them. "I don't think we're meant to." The Jeep sat scarred and dented, claw marks glowing faintly on the hood. But it still stood. So did they. The canyon felt different now, quiet in a way that wasn't empty, as if something ancient had passed through and left balance behind. Dawn came softly after the canyon night, not the harsh blaze that usually ruled the desert, but a pale, careful light that slid between the rocks and rested on the scarred hood of the Jeep. Caleb Hart stood beside the vehicle, hands on his hips, studying the claw marks etched into the metal. They would polish out eventually. Some marks always did. Laura joined him, coffee steaming between her hands. Neither of them spoke for a while. The desert stretched open and quiet, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. "That was real," she said finally. "Not a question." Caleb nodded. "Real enough." They got the Jeep running an hour later, loose, wiring a tired starter problems with simple solutions. By mid-morning they were back on the main road, the canyon shrinking behind them. No sign of the lions, no tracks they could see from the asphalt. Only memory. Back at Silver Dune, life returned to its familiar shape. Reports to file, fences to check, solar panels to clean. The kind of work that didn't ask questions and didn't offer answers. But something had changed. Caleb felt it in the way the silence settled now, not heavy, not hollow, but companionable. The desert hadn't become kinder. It had simply become known. Weeks passed, then months. Winter brushed the land lightly and moved on. Spring returned color to places Caleb had forgotten could still bloom. Every so often he'd find tracks near the ridge, large and confident, sometimes joined by another set just a little longer than before. He never followed them far. Some distances deserved to stay intact. One evening, as the sun sank low and turned the world amber, Caleb sat on the porch with his logbook open. He stared at the blank page for a long time before writing. He didn't record measurements. He didn't note weather. He wrote this instead. Trust crossed a boundary here, not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. He closed the book. Laura visited less often now. When she did, they talked about ordinary things. Supplies, budgets, staffing shortages. They didn't talk about the canyon night unless one of them needed reassurance that it had really happened. They both knew it had. One late afternoon, Caleb heard a sound he hadn't heard in months. A low rumble. Distant, carried by wind and stone. He didn't move, didn't answer. He only listened. Then it faded, rolling back into the wide breathing of the land. Caleb smiled. Some stories don't need an ending. They just need to be witnessed. The lesson. What happened at Silver Dune wasn't about bravery. It wasn't about heroism. And it certainly wasn't about control. It was about respect. The kind that understands boundaries but also recognizes when those boundaries must bend. The kind that listens before acting. The kind that knows trust is never free and never guaranteed. The Lioness did not come to Caleb because he was stronger. She came because she had no other choice, and because in her moment of greatest need she sensed something rare, a willingness to protect without possession. And Caleb survived not because he conquered the wild, but because he honored it. There is a lesson in that. Nature is not something to dominate or fear blindly. It is something to approach with humility, patience, and responsibility. When humans choose care over convenience, restraint over ego, and empathy over impulse, even the wildest lines can soften just enough to let life continue. Not every act of kindness will be returned, but some are. And when they are, they remind us that compassion across any boundary has weight, meaning, and power. Out there under a sky wide enough to hold every secret a ranger learned, that mercy can circle back when you least expect it. And somewhere beyond the ridges, a lioness and her son carried on free, strong, and alive. That was enough. If this story moved you, remember this. Every choice we make toward kindness, toward animals, toward people, toward the world we share, leaves a mark. Some fade, some return, and some change everything.